All right, today I get a chance to talk to somebody whose name I've been seeing for an awfully long time, but I've never actually spoken to. His name is Oli Larkin, and he does a little bit of everything. At least in my perception of him, he does a little of everything. So, what I want to do is I want to talk to him a little bit about how he does what he does, where he's coming from, all that stuff. But mostly, I want to start off by introducing him and having him tell us a little bit about what he does. So with that, I will say hello to Oli. Hey, Oli, how's it going?
Good, thanks. How are you?
I'm all right. Thank you so much for taking the time to be part of this podcast. I really appreciate it, man.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. So why don't we start off by having you... I mean, I almost hesitate to want to try and say the things you do because you have a lot of things that you juggle, and I'm not sure what is sort of like the thing that currently has your attention. So I will let you define it instead of trying to do so myself.
So I'd say I'm an audio programmer, basically. I get my kicks out of making audio software. I don't define myself as a musician. I just stopped really actually making music, and around about the time I got into programming. Somehow my brain just lends itself more towards the programming, but all the programming I do is to do with music and audio. I don't know, sometimes I feel like the way I approach coding is kind of like a frenzied way some kind of artist might approach making an album or something, rather than a very strict, disciplined kind of programming style like you probably want to have if you're actually doing it as a day job in a company.
Right.
But I've worked in various universities, and it's been a hobby, and I've been very lucky to have jobs which have kind of aligned with my hobby. Spent a long time teaching Macs and audio programming. So right. Somehow I managed to keep my hobby and my day job quite aligned.
Yeah, well, that puts you in a position of being like the envy of an awful lot of us, because to have that kind of alignment sort of makes any job a dream job if it's aligned in that way, right?
Yeah, sometimes I think it could be a mixed blessing because you have a good idea and you're still thinking about it before you go to bed or whatever. I suppose same with other jobs, but other jobs you're not tempted to fire up the computer and start coding late at night.
There is that sense, because it's part of like the quote like creative community, that somehow that makes like work obsession seem somehow okay, right?
Yeah. Well, it's something you have to keep check of. It's not really.
It's not really okay, right?
I mean, sometimes you get really great ideas at 2:00 in the morning and stuff like that. So
right, you gotta do what you gotta do, right? So I noticed from just sort of like doing a drive-by on your website and some of the stuff we exchanged email about, you have got your hands in a lot of different things. You've got this thing, iPlug, which is a framework for doing plug-in development. You're working with web audio stuff. You're working with the Faust language. You're somehow mixing juice programming in with that. And and at the same time, you're also doing work in some binaural and immersive recording stuff. How do you choose which thing to work on? Are you juggling them all at once, or do you like work on one for a while and then jump to the other? And if you do that, what's your current obsession?
I do juggle a lot, and sometimes things just magically seem to align, and I suddenly realize that all the different things I was juggling are actually the same thing. So, I mean, at the moment I'm doing a PhD and I'm developing software as part of that, and I'm developing software with iPlug, and iPlug needs an update. So, I'm kind of able to use one facet of my activities in another one, and kind of kill two birds with one stone. At the moment, my current obsession is the new version of iPlug, which is receiving quite a lot of work.
Now, that originally came out of the, I don't even know how to pronounce the name. Is it Kukos or Cuckos, or I don't know how you say that, but the Reaper, it's the Reaper people, right?
Yeah, it was originally developed by a guy called John Schwartz, who goes by the name Schwa, and he's now one of the main developers of Reaper, alongside Justin Frankel. And they I think it was mainly John Schwartz's project, but it uses lots of a thing called WDL or Whittle. They've got lots of strange acronyms for their bits of software. Anyway, it uses lots of their kind of library. It's all the code that they use to make Reaper, basically, all the open source side.
So, what is peculiar about the iPlug system that made you focus on it rather than just using a standard plugin framework?
Do you mean just using the APIs directly, or because iPlug and Juice are really the only two plugin frameworks that are publicly available?
Oh, that are across that work on multiple or have multiple output targets. You mean? Yeah. Yeah.
Originally, I started making plugins using some software called Synth, which is a great piece of software that's it's developed by a guy called Jeff McClintock, and this is kind of how I got into programming, really. I think even I started using Synth around about the same time as Max, but I made a load of stuff with it. Then eventually I wanted to make plugins that worked on Mac as well as Windows, because Synth is Windows only.
Okay.
So I started making plugins using Plugo, and then I had sold some stuff, and I had people interested in the things I was making, and I really wanted to make the products as professional as I possibly could. And at the end of the day, that means getting as close to the bone as possible, and basically getting your hands dirty and doing C++. And at that time, I didn't have a background in C++ programming, so I kind of kept on trying to make things using different SDKs. But obviously, you want a solution to do all of the different plugin formats, and I found iPlug at this time, and it was the most immediate one to me. So that's why I got started with that. Juice is
Did you start? Did you start that before Juice became available?
No, Juice was available, but at that time it was a one-man show, and it wasn't quite as developed as it is now. So to be honest, I could have saved myself about 5 years worth of work if I'd just used Juice, but I learned a lot about programming by taking iPlug and trying to update it and add various formats and fix bugs and stuff like that. So
now it sounds to me though that you actually, it was when you started using iPlug and started doing these kind of native based plugins, that's really when you started C++ programming. So how much of that was just learning C++ idioms, and how much of it was implementing DSP? I mean, my sense of it would be that a lot of that, at least, a significant portion of that time would have been just kind of getting up to doing commercial level C++ development.
To be honest, the way I got into it was actually making modules for Synth and externals for Mac. So before I was developing VST plugins, I was making these smaller components that had a more limited functionality. So I kind of built up my understanding of programming like that. And actually prior to that, I was doing a lot of JavaScript stuff in Mac. So yeah, I sort of gradually built it up, and I made a lot of mistakes.
But it sounds like it was sort of also it sounds like it was also a gradual maturity in programming, because Synth and Max are kind of very approachable ways to do some basic programming concepts. And like you said, with Plugo, you could, and with Synth you could get to the point of making some plugins, but then you kind of hit a wall at some point. It sounded like you had this kind of graduated mechanism of getting to the point of being a programmer.
Yeah, definitely. And I still got a bit of a complex about it. Like I feel like I'm an imposter, or imposter syndrome, is it?
Right.
But then other people are like, what, you do C++? That's voodoo. And
right.
I'm like, no, it's not really. But
now, kind of in a similar but completely different vein, you're also involved in the development of something called web audio modules. which
Yeah.
is using web audio technologies to make sort of like pluggable synthesizers, if I'm getting it right. Am I sort of getting it right?
Yes, it's essentially a kind of a VST plugin style entity for web audio. I don't know how much your listeners will know about web audio, but basically it's this kind of audio graph-based DSP system that's actually widely available in most of the browsers that we use these days, and it's kind of replaced Flash audio for web-based stuff. It's remarkably similar to something like Max or PD. It's pretty cool. There's lots of interesting things that people have made with it, but the web audio API specifies lots of nodes which are kind of at the level of maybe a Max external or a synthetic object. So they might be an oscillator or a filter, and there's not really any kind of entity that could be an instrument or an effect with lots of parameters. I went to the first ever web audio conference at EarCam several years ago, I guess 2 or 3 years ago, and I saw a presentation by this guy called Jari Klamola, who is my collaborator on the WAM project, and it's mainly him, to be honest, but I'm like the hype man. I think it's really cool, and he gave a presentation at this first web audio conference where he'd got loads of plugins, desktop plugins, working in the web browser. The interfaces basically looked the same, and the audio was the same. Yeah, you can play them via web MIDI. What he'd done, he'd used a technology called mscripting, which is developed by someone at Mozilla, and well, quite a lot of people at Mozilla probably. Okay. And it's a technology that allows you to convert C++ code into JavaScript. And yeah, he'd got this kind of pipeline going where he was converting the code from some open source desktop plugins so that they ran as a web page. That's got quite a lot of exciting potential, I think. We're not quite there yet with the web audio stuff being powerful enough to run a DAW that could compete with a desktop DAW. Right. But I think we might be a lot closer to that in 5 or 10 years' time. So we want to make an API for doing these kinds of instruments and effects like you can with VST plugins. I mean, we want to get that right at an early stage. So it's a completely open thing, and we're inviting people to collaborate with us. So yeah, after I met Jari the first time, we got on quite well because we both like 80 synthesizers. And we decided to formulate a proper API to write plugins in C++ and then make them loadable by hosts and make them communicate.
Yeah, it does. The one thing I'm curious about is, so I understand now about building the synths. How would people like hook this up within their website? I mean, is it just a regular web audio API node then, or is it something higher level than that?
When we compile a WAM, a web audio module, we are using a technology that's the final addition to the web audio 1.1 spec, which is this thing called the audio worklet. This is a node on the web audio graph that lets you do custom DSP in a way that doesn't make your audio glitch. So previously there was a thing called the script processor node, which allowed you to do the same thing, but basically the audio processing wasn't on the right thread. So if you started playing some notes on your web audio module synthesizer, and then you maximized your browser window, or the browser had to redraw something, it would totally glitch out the audio. So yeah, if you want to try that, you can go to webaudiomodules.org and you'll find a version of my Casio emulation, which will glitch like crazy if you try and do anything.
Well, it's interesting because I was actually going to ask you about the Casio thing, because one of the things I've noticed that's like a through line in a lot of your work is these different homages to the CZ Casio synth series. Was that like your first synth, or is that just the sound that caught your attention?
No, it wasn't my first synth. I don't really know why I got hooked on Casio CZs. I think it's an amazing piece of engineering by the Casio engineers. It's a really neat and powerful synthesis engine that was very, very clever. I mean, obviously the DX series and the FM synthesis technology and theory developed by John Chowning is amazing, but Casio's phase distortion is really, really neat technique, and in terms of playability and controllability, it's pretty amazing. And they made these entirely digital synths in 1984 that could get some quite analog sounds, and were pretty much band limited, which is pretty cool.
Kind of remarkable for the time, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I got into it because I was teaching audio synthesis and kind of going through different techniques, and I just thought these resonant waveforms that you get on the Casio synths were quite an interesting thing. And gradually I turned it into a Max patch, and made it polyphonic and stuff, and then made a Max for Live device, and I was starting to get sounds that are really quite close to the real the factory patches on the CZ101. Mm-hmm. So at some stage I may as well go one step further and make a fully blown emulation, because basically it was the one synth that nobody had emulated properly. And I had an opportunity to collaborate with Plugin Boutique in Brighton, and had a few different sort of half-finished things, including this. And this one seemed like potentially successful, or potentially a good idea to turn into a fully blown product. Sure. Most of the stuff I do is completely weird and esoteric, and some drone musicians might like it, but an emulation of the Casio synthesizer that was many people's first synth, it's got a bit more broad appeal. So
you said something there that kind of caught my attention. You said that you wanted to take stuff one step further, and I would say that when I look at a lot of your work, that kind of is that's kind of a byline of a lot of your stuff, is sort of like taking a concept maybe one step further. I'm a little curious. One of the things I like talking to people about in my podcast is kind of how they got to be the artists or builders or creators that they are. And in your case, I'm kind of curious because you obviously have, I mean, you say that you don't identify as a musician, but you have like some kind of innate love for music and audio. You started off not being a programmer, but that's your primary place. So I'm curious about how, what your journey looks like. How did you get started? Where did the interest in music and audio come from, even prior to being involved in programming?
I didn't exactly grow up in a musical family. I mean, my dad is passionate about music. He's got a vast record collection. He's just a hobbyist musician, but likes guitars and sitars and things like that. And so I guess I was immersed in music that way. When I went to school, in secondary school, I started playing guitar. Yeah, I kind of got into the recording side of things because we had 4 tracks and that kind of thing in the music department at the school I was at. And just kind of got the bug of sort of building up a small collection of recording equipment. I played in a few bands at that time, and at that stage I would have said, I want to be a music producer. I was thinking at the time, I didn't think I was going to be a programmer because I wasn't really that into that kind of computing at the time. I mean, I was kind of a teenager around the time that computers started being able to do real-time audio, and around when VST sort of came onto the scene. So I was trying these early DAWs, and things sort of really changed. I guess when I was about 17 and I don't know, 21 and 22, like the technology really changed quite a lot. So
where were you that you had access to some of these tools? Because one of the things that happened was when this first stuff came out, it was all commercial. It all cost a pile of money, and you had to kind of be either doing pretty well financially or in the right place to get access to these tools. Where were you that gave you access?
My school had had an Atari, so I messed around with that a bit. I mean, we had a fairly basic Windows PC. When I went to the sixth form at my school, I really wanted to do music technology as my. We have A levels, which are what you do when you're sort of 17 and 18 in the school in the UK. So these are kind of exam, your final exams that you take at school. So I really wanted to do music technology A level, which was an option, but not an option at my school. So I went to the local college. So I was kind of split between two institutions, and that was the first time I got to use proper recording studios, I guess. But I mean, they were pretty good. But then I went to university and got access to a lot more facilities.
Well, your timing probably couldn't have been much better, because there, that time when VST programs that supported VST plugins and stuff all hit, that was an amazing time period because things changed so fast. It went from being a recording studio had to have like 20 pieces of external gear to now you could imagine pretty sophisticated recordings happening inside the box, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So as sort of like a fledgling production person with the idea of production, who were you recording at the time?
I was actually, playing a lot of guitar, and as I said, I would have considered myself a musician and a producer at that time. I was mainly working with just on my own, to be honest. I was in a few bands playing guitar, but made a few recordings of the band. But around where I lived, which is in the southeast of England, there was a bit of a rave scene, a party scene in the countryside. Lots of parties every weekend, and this kind of music called it's Goa trance, or it was becoming psy trance at the time. And that was very popular in the area where I'm from. Okay. And I was really into it, and there were lots of producers who I really liked, and I would try and emulate their sounds in my productions. Yeah, I was mainly working on my own, and getting really into the details of electronic music production and trying to make the trippiest sounds possible, basically. But I thought I needed to go and study electroacoustic music and the kind of tools that composers use from the kind of academic tradition, because I thought I was introduced to some of that by one of my teachers at college, and I was like, whoa, these manipulations of sound are really amazing, and if I want to make really trippy music, I need to learn how to use phase vocoders. Unfortunately, that turned out not to be very rewarding.
It turned out not to be the case.
If you want to make some kind of babbling brook, watery FFT sounds, then yeah, but
didn't work in psytrance though.
No.
So you started fishing around with that, but what was the transfer for you to then kind of put you in the place of not focusing on the music side and instead focusing on the programming? I mean, it seems like, at least at this point in the story, you were still very much identifying yourself as a musician. What was the turning point for you that just said, I want to focus on the technology side?
I think it was probably the realization of, that I wasn't particularly great at the music side of it. I find it so hard to to know when something's finished or to even finish something. I mean, I still occasionally love to mess around, starting to make some music, but somehow the process of programming my own software, I got so absorbed in that and it was so rewarding when you kind of finally finished something and uploaded it, and people liked it, and it clearly did what it was meant to. There was nothing ambiguous, or music's so subjective. Whereas if a bit of code works, it works. If it doesn't work, it either doesn't make noise, crashes your computer, or makes a really horrible noise.
Yeah, the result is really clear, right? You don't have to wait for the crowd's approval to find out whether program's working or not. Yeah, that's actually really that's an interesting point.
Obviously, you shouldn't really care about what other people think about your music, but it's
well, that's an ideal. Yeah, I don't know of anybody that actually follows that ideal. That everybody cares what other people think.
Yeah. But it's just, I don't know. It didn't feel like my calling to just make music. I mean, I've got friends who it's just in their blood, or like, you know, it's, I mean, they have writer's block, I'm sure, but they just keep on doing it. There's no question about stopping, really. It's just what they do. And
Right.
I kind of feel like I'm the same with programming now, but the music didn't come naturally to me, although I was still like, you know, passionate, an obsessive listener of music, and, you know, always aspired to one day, you know, actually start making music again. And if I go to a gig and I don't think it's that great, I just think, oh, I could do way better than this.
Right.
And then I don't.
So now you're focused, like, very, very particularly on technological pursuits with audio, but it also seems like you do have your fingers in a lot of pies. And I noticed just from, you know, again, just doing, even a cursory drive-by just points to a lot of different offshoots of things that you're involved in. So I noticed that at some of the Juice conferences, you actually were talking about the Faust language and supporting Faust, the Faust library inside of Juice builds. Why don't you explain really quickly what that's about, what Faust is about, and why you would even go through that effort?
Okay, so Faust is a domain-specific language for audio signal processing, and it's a functional programming language. It's a text-based language, so I guess more like SuperCollider than it is like Max or PD, but what actually you're describing block diagrams in Faust code, and it has a syntax for describing the way that, you know, a signal might fork or merge. You've got different ways of composing audio signals. So yeah, you're describing an audio graph. Yeah, it's got a very expressive syntax. I'm not sure that's quite the right word, but it's extremely powerful, and you can do some very complex kind of routings in a very small amount of code. Yeah, I discovered Faust through a Max object called Faust Gen, which isn't actually related to Gen tilde in Max, but it's using a similar technology, which is this compiler technology called LLVM, which allows you to do a just-in-time compilation, which basically means that you can get very high-performance code on the fly rather than having to compile something offline in Xcode or Visual Studio. So yeah, you can kind of script something inside Max, and it gets compiled to very optimized code on the fly. Mm-hmm. Faust Gen was quite interesting to me because I was doing some physical modeling stuff. I'm fascinated by physical modeling synthesis, and one of the most appealing things about Faust is that it has a fantastic library of DSP routines, which are largely developed at Stanford by Julius Smith, who is one of the best brains in the world for DSP, and, like, you know, everyone will go to his pages to you know, learn about particular kinds of filters or particular, you know, certain kinds of physical modeling or whatever. And here's a programming language that's actually got code written by him. So it's got like textbook quality examples that demonstrate, you know, almost everything's on his site. It's really, really great in that respect. Both Gen tilde and Faust Gen tilde were quite exciting to me because, as I'm sure you know, it's nice being able to do this kind of low levels feedback and stuff without, you know, having to get your hands dirty with C++ and having to go through this kind of offline compilation process, which can destroy the flow of ideas and that kind of thing. I had this project, PMix, which was something that I started a long time ago when I did an internship in Paris at the GRM, where they got me to do some research into preset interpolation. I ended up making a Max patch to do it, and a library for Max. This was before the nodes object existed. So this is basically the same thing as the nodes object. Anyway, I made that into an application which is on the Mac App Store, And I always wanted to make loads of little devices for it that could work well with preset interpolation. And I was really making things very quickly using Faust, and I wanted to make the next version of PMix. So the Juice library has a lot of great functionality for hosting your own plugins and doing all the kind of graph stuff. And I thought, well, if I can combine Faust and this JIT compilation stuff into my new version of PMix, then I can make something really cool. And I made a Juice module so that other people can do that as well. There isn't a way to JIT compile Faust stuff as a VST plugin other than PMix, so I kind of did it with that in mind. That project's kind of become a bit unclear what it is now. It's like is it a preset interpolator or is it a Faust IDE? The code's currently rotting on GitHub, and I need to think about what to do with that, but I'm distracted with other things at the moment.
So what, for you, what was the draw of, was it just getting close to the hardware, the move from like graphical programming languages like SynthEdit or Max to C++ and Faust? I mean, it sounds like Faust isn't necessarily closer to the hardware, although I guess the LLVM compiling would do that. But is there something about textual languages that you find, like, is it more elegant or more efficient, or has your brain changed to more embrace that style of programming?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's more manageable from my perspective. I was making plugins with SynthEdit and Max, and with those platforms, although they're great and they're fantastic tools for artists and people, I mean, you can make professional software with those tools, but at the end of the day, if if one of your customers has got a problem and it's in a part of the code that you don't have control over, then I don't know, something is wrong about turning around to that customer saying, "Look, I'm sorry, it's not my problem. I can't do anything about it."
Right.
So being in control of those things is quite important. I think if you're selling software, you should take that responsibility. So that's one reason for it. And getting so much into text-based programming, going back to making a Max patch and having wires all over the place, it just feels unmanageable. And my brain has changed, I think. When I make a Max patch, I mean, I still use Max absolutely loads. I've been using it a lot for my PhD work. I often end up with these Max patches that have got sort of one object and then some controls going into that object. It might be a JavaScript thing, or maybe an external that I made, or a Faust gen, and then there's not much going on in the Max patch itself. So your brain does change, I think, once you can kind of be in control of the code at a lower level.
Sure.
You start to see how you can implement things more simply and concisely and make it more maintainable.
There certainly is a different organizational scheme that comes with textual programming. That's for sure.
Yeah. I don't want to say bad things about any of these things. I love them all. But, although Faust can write extremely concise code, at the moment, it's not so easy to debug stuff in Faust. But, there's only a few people working on it, and hopefully one day it will be. But so they've all got their advantages and disadvantages. But the kind of position I'm in, it's beneficial for me to be able to dip in and out of all these different things. And so I really appreciate the functionality that everything gives me. And if I'm making a product, I'll probably do it in C++. But if I'm experimenting, prototyping, or making something that's on a kind of ad hoc basis, then I may well use other languages.
So you're given the number of different things, and boy, we didn't even get into the binaural and immersive audio stuff, but our time is already shot. I can't believe it. But before we go, I'm curious, for a person in your position where you are working simultaneously with a lot of technologies, you're kind of deep into the research world, but you're also doing some commercial stuff. You have kind of tendrils into a lot of parts of music technology. I'm curious, from your perspective, Sometimes I ask people where do they think the future is going, but in your case, I would like to ask it a slightly different way. What direction would you like it to go? I mean, there seems to be a lot of people fishing around with things like machine learning and AI systems. There also is a lot of experimentation with different, with pushing the envelope on different kinds of synthesis mechanisms or programming languages and programming techniques. What is it that you're most interested in seeing grow and develop?
I think, well, one thing I would say, part of my efforts with iPlug have been about basically making it a lot easier to get into programming your own stuff with languages like C++. And there's been lots of changes that have made that much more approachable than it was when I started. And so, yeah, I would like low-level programming to be a bit less of a mysterious voodoo thing. More people to get into that. In this day and age, it's just such a useful skill to be able to do a bit of C++ or JavaScript. I've taught at a lot of institutions where working with musicians, or the students are coming from a musical background, and just trying to get people to get into programming and to not see it as this frightening thing that's not for them. Like being able to get your hands dirty with these low level things much more easily is one thing that it's already happening, and I hope it happens more and more and more. So, yeah.
You just want the world to be more like you, is what you're saying.
I don't know about that, but...
Well, Oli, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have a chat. This was a lot of fun. And it was really interesting to get to hear sort of your perspectives on stuff and just get a chance to hear all the different ways that you're experimenting with the world of sound. It was really great, man.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks. It was nice talking to you.
All right. Okay, and with that, I will say goodbye then. Bye.
Bye, Darwin.
I want to thank Oli for the chance to talk and learn a little bit more about all the different things that he does. It was really interesting. I want to thank you, the listeners, for showing up again this week, for continuing to show up. The numbers are really great. I also want to really thank Synthtopia.com, whose help has really upped the numbers and really gotten a lot more people interested in the podcast. I'm going to be taking a week off, so next week is going to be a no podcast week. We'll be coming back to you on April the 15th. And with that, I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much, and we'll catch you next time around.